Okay, today we're going to talk about EXERGY injectors. We get a lot of questions about what size injectors do I need for different horsepower applications, and there's a lot of different options, and a lot of different companies have different test equipment. So when one company talks about a 50 liter per minute versus a 50% over injector, there's a lot of people that get confused as far as what size injector they really need for their application. So we're going to kind of start at the bottom, and the Sportsman injector is the stock replacement injector that EXERGY sells, and that they take a stock injector straight from Bosch, and they hone the nozzle to 11% over. You get a little bit better throttle response, 11% more fuel quantity, but for the most part it is equal to stock injector. Your stock fuel map, your stock tuning, you really don't need to get a retune when you go to a Sportsman injector, but you do get a little bit better increase. You know, if you take a stock injector and max it out, you can generally do 550 horsepower comfortably on a 5.9 injector maxed out, and with a aftermarket turbo. And if you do a Sportsman injector, you might make 575 or 580. So it's not a huge difference going from a stock injector to a Sportsman injector, but it is a small increase. And then stepping up from there, they have the 50 horsepower and they have the 100 horsepower. And the reason they are rated by horsepower is because these are actual Bosch nozzles. They're sack nozzles that were made for a different application, that the OEM horsepower rating was 50 horsepower more than the 350 horsepower, the 325 horsepower output of the stock Cummins injector. So when you talk about a 6.7 injector, that stock horsepower rating was 350, a stock late 5.9 injector was 325, an early 5.9 was 305. So they always start with their stock nozzle they take the stock nozzle and they flow just the nozzle, and then they increase the horsepower according to that. So when you buy a 50 horsepower injector from EXERGY Performance, that is actually a horsepower rating that would be, instead of the 325 horsepower from Dodge, you're getting an injector that would be rated at 375 horsepower in the same calibration, injector pulse width, rail pressure parameters. So a 50 horsepower injector, generally we would sell that to the customer that wants to make a maximum of 600 horsepower on a 5.9 Cummins platform. And the 50 horsepower injector gives you a little bit better throttle response again. It gives you more fuel quantity available at the same lower pulse width, wakes the truck up, but it's not so much fuel quantity that you really have to worry about exhaust gas temperatures going crazy, smoke being really high. You don't have to get a retune for those, but you probably should, because if you run a max effort tune for your stock injectors and then you pop 50 horsepower injectors in there, now you're going to have too much fuel quantity for what your CP3 can handle. So anytime you go above the Sportsman injector, we do recommend getting aftermarket tuning for your truck. On the 100 horsepower injectors, we have seen as much as 779 horsepower out of a 100 horsepower injector. That's stretching the injector pulse width out pretty far, like 2,900 microseconds. I personally don't like to stretch them out that far if I don't need to, but it is something that can be done. So on the 100 horsepower injectors, generally on a stock CP3, you can make a stock CP3 and a 100 horsepower injector is enough fuel quantity for 650 horsepower if you've got the comparable turbo for it. If you add a 10 mil stroker pump or a 12 mil pump to a 100 horsepower, you can stretch that into the high 700s if you have a decent sized turbo, like an S466 or S467 would get you, and a 100 horsepower injector would get you 750 horsepower. And that is a well-rounded street truck. You can turn it down, still daily drive it, not have a bad smoke control. It's a good bang for the buck in the injector. Now, the next step in injectors starts becoming more expensive, because now when EXERGY is building these injectors, they're not taking a Bosch nozzle that was designed for another application. They're starting with the stock nozzle, and they're using their EDM machine, which will very precisely cut a hole size, hole angle, however they decide, in the nozzle, and then they hone it lightly to get their perfect balance. All the nozzles are balanced with 1% flow of each other, and that extra labor that it takes them to build those nozzles, that is why the price goes up once you start going away from the Sportsman 50 horsepower and 100 horsepower injectors. So when you order a 60% injector or 100% injector, 150% injector, all of those take a lot more time to build in their facility because they're calibrating each nozzle flow and running a hone material through on that last final 1 or 2 thou that they're opening the hole sizes to get that where they want, get the flow where they're wanting it to go. So as you go up in the line, your price continues to increase, but then also your horsepower capability goes up. So just as a quick crash course, a 60% injector is slightly larger than 100 horsepower. Generally you can do 8 to 850 with a 60% on a max effort. 100% over, we can generally do 900 to 950 on a max effort, and a 150% we can run up to 1100 horsepower. A 200% over, we can make 1200 horsepower. A 300% we can make up to 1400 horsepower. So what happens is as you increase your injector size, you want to also increase your airflow. So when we say a horsepower number related with your injector size, it really has a big effect on the rest of the setup on whether that horsepower rating is actually accurate. And that's why EXERGY has chosen to give a calibration map that shows you exact total milligrams of fuel that you're getting with your injectors that you have, and then what you do with that amount of fuel quantity is going to be determined on whether you get your desired output. So if you take 300 milligrams of fuel and you put a stock appearing turbo on it with maybe a bigger wheel in it, you might only get 700 or 800 horsepower out of that 300 milligrams of fuel. But if we put that 300 milligrams of fuel in our ProMod S10 and we add 5 stages of nitrous with a big 98 millimeter turbo, that's enough fuel quantity to make 1900 horsepower. So the same amount of fuel quantity makes a vast difference in your horsepower depending on the rest of your application. So it is important to get the injector size correctly so that you can reach your goals. So we always try to get the customer in the right ballpark. I always tell the guys to buy 1 set of injectors so that you can grow into it, because you can buy a 200% over injector that's good enough for 1200 horsepower and turn it down to 900 horsepower for 3 years until you get a bottom end built, and then you can add that bigger turbo, turn your power up, and you've only bought 1 set of injectors. Because every time you buy and sell injectors, generally it's going to cost you some money. And a lot of people ask me why EXERGY as opposed to a lot of other brands that are on the market. And while there are other injector builders that build good injectors, we have been to EXERGY, we've been to some other fuel shops, and EXERGY's test equipment is bar none. The amount of knowledge depths that they have an in-house engineering team that they make a lot of their own test equipment, and their capabilities are far beyond your average diesel repair shop or your fuel injection shop. And they can take an injector like this and they can do shot-to-shot analysis where they actually fire the injector at a camera and they take the picture of the shot that's the camera's timed with the injector firing to where they can see what the exact spray plumes look like, and then they can also fire it into a machine that they built that they can see the actual injector rate trace. And what that does is when this solenoid here fires for 2000 microseconds, so that means when the solenoid turns on, it's on for 2000 microseconds and it turns back off. It's a length of time. Well, the mechanical response to that solenoid varies as you make modifications to your injector. So if you open the injector, it might take 200 microseconds for that control rod to get to full lift, and then it's on for 2000 microseconds when the solenoid turns off. If you modify the injector incorrectly, the rail pressure that's underneath the seat can actually hold the injector open longer, and you might have a 800 to 1000 microsecond end of injection time. So your total injector delivery rate is 3000 microseconds instead of the 2000 microseconds that the tuner commanded. And the tuner will never know that, because in the data log looking back, it only shows the time that the injector was charged. And EXERGY has the ability to actually accurately measure that rate trace of the injector, exactly how that's shaped, and then they can, because of that, as a tuner, you can confidently say, I'm delivering this much fuel quantity before top dead center, this much after, and you know exactly where you're at. Because if you modify that incorrectly, you can effectively change your injection timing in your injector by 3 or 4 degrees without even the tuner knowing it. So if you modify your injector without that knowledge, then you put that in your truck and you make 2,000 horsepower. You might think you're at 30 degrees of timing at 3,000 RPM, but you're actually delivering at 34 degrees of timing or 4 degrees less. So there's a lot more to the picture when it comes to testing fuel equipment than just delivering, firing the injector, measuring the total fuel quantity, because it is important that the quantity of fuel is delivered in that same window that's close to the stock injector, how it was designed originally. And that's what a lot of our smaller shops that don't have the test equipment that EXERGY does, they miss out on that. They understand that there's delays, but they don't know exactly where they're at. And that is why we've chosen to work with EXERGY specifically, because if you go visit them in Grand Rapids, Michigan, you will find a shop that is just a bunch of eye candy for anybody who's into mechanical engineering or anything like that. There is some phenomenal test equipment in there that's very intriguing. I'd love to be able to take you guys on a tour there sometime, but that is the main reason we choose EXERGY, is not just the results speaking for themselves, but after going there and seeing that they have a full understanding and the ability to test every aspect of the fuel system that they build. That's why we choose EXERGY. So I hope this helps with getting a decent idea of your injector sizing. If we can help in any way, helping you choose your whole setup, we're here to help here at Firepunk. Give us a call, 614-733-3744, and we would be glad to help.